Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz, Haider. This program comes to you from the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. A word about CESPA. It's an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore. It tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments. And this program is part of that effort. Now, this episode of InFocus, the tech export controls put in place by the United States and its allies to stymie China's tech development, most notably in cutting-edge semiconductor technology. Now, back in 1990, Edward Luttwak, who was an American policy writer, he coined the term geoeconomics and presented the term as an admixture of the logic of conflict with the methods of commerce. Geoeconomics was seen as an extension of geopolitics, i.e., using economic means to pursue geopolitical goals. Later in 2016, Robert Blackwell, who's a former US ambassador, and Jennifer Harris, they wrote a book, War by Other Means, Geoeconomics and Statecraft. And this book further explains the concept as the use of economic instruments to promote and defend national interests and to produce beneficial geopolitical results and the effects of other nations' economic actions on a country's geopolitical goals. Now, targeted sanctions, as we know, were always in play, but they have, over the last 10 years, and especially since Donald Trump, been honed against China and its tech sector. Within the tech sector, the US has targeted China's semiconductor industry. Semiconductors are, as most of us know, they're the oil of today's economy. And the US is aware of it, as anyone who has read the US National Security Strategy for 2022 can see. The US National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, has described export controls as a new strategic asset in the US and allied toolkit. And he referred and used this phrase, small yard, high fence strategy. There's a Rhodium Group report which appeared last year, and it indicated that the rules are both narrowly focused on critical technology domains like high-performance computing, but are at the same time far-reaching in their ambition to choke off China's capacity to develop and scale leading-edge semiconductors. Today, I have with me Ansgar Baums, who's a Helmut Schmidt Fellow at the German Marshall Fund. Baums was formerly in government relations at Telecommunications. Prior to that, he held other positions within the world, most recently as head of the Global Strategy Program at Hewlett-Packard and as head of government relations, Europe, Middle East, Africa at HP. And Baums has recently written about what he calls the choke point fallacy of tech export controls. So his basic argument is that US export controls on certain technologies might do more harm than good, giving China an incentive to develop indigenous capabilities. Of course, for the details, I have questions for him. So welcome to the program, Ansgar. It's great to have you on the program. Let me begin by, I'm going to start by playing the devil's advocate, right? So let me begin by asking you a somewhat simple question. Now, in any case, I'm picking this up from the argument that you have presented in your Stimson Center article. While it incentivizes and perhaps galvanizes China's indigenous development, the fact is that in any case, China, as you know way better than me, has been trying to indigenize and move towards cutting edge, chip technology. Now, so China, in any case, is going to do that. So how can then we fault the US for trying to stymie its progress, because they are primarily concerned about the applications in military technologies, and the backdrop is China's more assertive power projection in East and South China Seas. So why would we fault them for trying to go for these choke points?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Ejaz, for having me on the show and for your questions. So first of all, I'd like to point out that the idea of choke points in tech value chains that could be weaponized for geopolitical purposes, as you laid out in your introduction, is a pretty new idea. It's not that it has been around forever. Export controls historically were aiming at literally at dual-use goods or military goods, so much more restrained, and didn't particularly focus on the idea of I have a tech value chain, there is a choke point, and if I pressure this choke point, I can achieve geopolitical means. That's a pretty new idea. In the Stimson Center article, we trace it back to some academic articles. The problem that I have with it is I think it's not accurately describing how technology value chains are actually working. The idea of a choke point is a very linear idea, right? That you have this one stream and there's one choke point, and if you press it, you can stop innovation on the other side. I think if there's one thing that we've learned from technology innovation is that if you put an obstacle in its way, it will find a way around, right? This is how technology works, almost more like a river that finds its way if you put an obstacle in the middle of it. The problem with the current export control in semiconductor industries is that if you compare how the Chinese efforts to become competitive in semiconductor manufacturing were prior to the export controls and how they are performing now, you see a stark contrast. And they were failing big time before. China invested billions of dollars in the so-called Big Fund 1 and 2 rounds of subsidies. And they basically ended up in really underwhelming technologies, and they ended up in big-time corruption. They were up to the highest level that was graphed. It was really unimpressive. And that all changed once these export controls, the so-called October 7th export controls kicked in. And from my perspective, the main difference is that these export controls removed choice. And particularly, they remove choice for Chinese semiconductor customers. So imagine you are an aspiring Chinese high-tech company and you want to deliver the best services to your customers. Before, you had the choice between underperforming Chinese chips and world-class NVIDIA chips. When you remove that choice, it's clear that the pressure in the system will increase by very demanding customers, and they will basically push Chinese semiconductor companies to perform much better simply because they now have to rely on them. And I think this is exactly the dynamic that we have seen over the last years now since October 7th sanctions kicked in China. And you can tell that companies who are really affected, like Huawei, are basically dragging a whole ecosystem with them to perform better. And basically, you could argue, ironically, these export controls delivered to the Chinese innovation system what it lacked before, which is necessity and this lack of choice. And you basically solve all the problems that a central planning economy has, which is, inefficiencies, lack of an ecosystem that is demanding. It's more a push than a pull. Basically, the US has solved this central planning problem of the Chinese economy for them, which is kind of ironic.
Right. So I'm still playing the devil's advocate, right?
Yeah.
So, you've obviously read Chris Miller's Chip War, and the whole idea of Moore's Law. Now, that the supply chains and the entire thing is spread across the globe. And so you have the Taiwanese TSMC, you've got the ASML in Holland. The idea is conceived in the US, and then it goes and it gets fabricated in Taiwan, then photolithography happens in Holland, packaging happens somewhere else, and all of that. And I understand, because I think when you say it has removed choice, you are actually focusing on something very important, because obviously if you can get cutting edge chips, you really don't have to focus so much on the chips that lag behind cutting edge technology. Now the choice has been removed. Having said that, given the supply chain, given that various steps of the manufacturing and supply chain processes require expertise spread across the world, and also the fact that this is one of the most expensive industries, how soon do you think or how effectively do you think China will be able to indigenize so many different processes that are spread across the world?
That's a good question, and I'm not an expert in lithography or any of the other detailed technologies, right? So I would refer for that to real experts of the industry. But I would like to point out first, we've already seen that stuff in China has happened that wasn't supposed to happen, right? So you found out that DUV machines, which is one generation behind the latest EUV machines produced by ASML, have been tuned and upgraded to produce chips node size 5, which was regarded as very unlikely prior to these sanctions. So you already see tinkering innovation in China, tuning existing stocks of machinery. But taking a step back, I think it's, yes, the complexity is there. The supply chain is very global. It's very complex, and it's very, very expensive to try to catch up. But let's take a step back and think about this. Semiconductors are so important, as you laid out. China is a country with an almost unlimited resource of people. Focusing on STEM, has enough money to make it happen. It's basically a matter of time until China will find a way. That's assured. That's literally. I don't know anyone in the industry who would object to that. So in the end, what we are doing right now is we are buying a short-term advantage over a long-term problem, which is we lose any leverage over the Chinese semiconductor ecosystem simply because they will become independent, and that's a better trade-off, I find. And focusing on the node size and production capabilities of semiconductors is one thing, but I just want to highlight to another development, which is that on the computing architecture side, China is now also going its own ways, right? So becoming less dependent on Western IP in the compute architecture is a major strategic objective now. And look at the RISC-V project, very interesting what's happening right there. That's an alternative compute architecture, open source, that is now widely used in China. So I think what we see here, triggered by these export controls, is that the IT world literally will split in two, a Chinese ecosystem and the Western ecosystem. You could argue that this split is unavoidable because it's somewhat following the geopolitical split, right? So you could almost say that the IT stack that we had before wasn't global, it was unipolar because it was born in the unipolar moment after 1990. Now that the world is changing into a bipolar-ish structure, the IT world is basically following it. And that's something that we see right now. Question is this really in our interest? I find it interesting that if you think it through, export controls as we see them today are only logical if you argue from a position of weakness. Prior, the US was very happy to promote the dissemination of its technologies because it was basically saying what's good for the internet and the global IT stack is good for the US, right? Our companies are benefiting from it because we are dominant. Now it's basically saying, no, we cannot allow our technologies to be spread globally anymore. We have to restrict it. And that's a fundamental change of how the US is thinking about the world and how to deal with geopolitical competitors.
Right. So this is essentially offshoot of the peer competition and the pressure of the peer competition that the US faces or perceives to face from China, and specifically not so much in terms of China making a lot of wealth. I mean, I remember 3 years ago, I was talking to Professor John Mearsheimer, and he had an interesting point to make. He said he was in Beijing and the talk, and the Chinese came, and the Chinese said, "Well, Professor, how can we avoid the Thucydides trap?" And so, Professor Mearsheimer, if you can keep making wealth and just that, the US will have no problem. But if you were to begin to invest that wealth into modernizing your military, then the US will sit up and take notice. Now, let me go back to the argument that the proponents of these choke points present, which is that even if China begins to develop, and I think your inevitability argument is well taken as far as I'm concerned, they argue that US and its allies will still be 2 to 3 generations. They will remain 2 to 3 generations ahead of China. And so their argument is that this is what we want. The other issue is that we have seen in other areas of military development and development of military systems is the commodification. So the US began with these very expensive drones. Now a number of non-state actors are making these drones that are much cheaper, and you have to acquire missiles priced at anywhere from $2 million to shoot down a $20,000 or a $40,000 drone. But commodification in the chip industry is not possible. So I'm just sort of presenting the arguments that the proponents present.
Yeah. So, I mean, what you're basically pointing out are two very contradicting hypotheses on how the future of war will be fought like, right? And I completely agree. In the end, the dissemination of technology, some people say it's a democratization. I think that's not the right term for it. But in the end, the easy access to low tech, basically, that's reassembled to acquire a very potent weapon that could challenge weapon systems which are much more expensive. That's a trend that we are seeing, and the Ukraine battlefield is basically showcasing what is possible now with these new technologies. And that's basically irregardless of high-end AI chips, right? I mean, it's not about NVIDIA chips to fly a drone with an explosive on it. So that's happening, and that's something that requires attention from military planning, right? On the other side, what you're alluding to is there is now this hypothesis of military-civil fusion, right, which became the standard term in policymaking, assuming that in the end you cannot distinguish anymore between innovation in the military space versus innovation in the civil space. Therefore, our old concept of dual-use goods needs to be expanded radically, right? So dual-use was still a very restricted export control category. Now we're talking about emerging technologies, which is the new term that's now used for structuring export controls. And this is where it becomes really very blurred. In the end, you could argue IT is a general purpose technology of our days, right? It's the definition of a GPT, which implies that it is impossible to contain, really. If there's one core idea behind GPT is that it will spread, right? The combustion engine spread, the steam engine spread. There is no way that you can really curb this innovation from spreading. And this now contradicts really this idea of we have a set of emerging technologies and we put some guardrails around it, and we will make sure that first, these guardrails are effective, so this technology is not spreading. Second, we will limit it to the technologies that we had originally in mind, so we keep the scope clearly defined. This is what Jake Sullivan meant with small yard, right, and high fence.
Yeah, high fence.
The problem that I see is it's almost impossible to keep it small. And one thing that I find interesting is that there's a saying, it takes two to tango. In the end, if the US is defining one set of technologies that it likes to weaponize with its choke points, it will be a matter of Chinese response to be factored in how small the yard then really stays, right? And one concern that we have in our forthcoming book, The Tech Cold War, is that there is a real incentive for China to respond in kind and weaponize a lot of those technologies that we actually need to fight climate change. So it's a bad timing to wage a tech cold war in times when we really need tech to save humanity. And that's not an abstract idea. That's already something that's very real when you look at raw materials required for batteries, solar panels, etc. pp. There are already voices in US Congress saying like, we should slow down energy transition because energy transition might make us more dependent on Chinese technology. And if you think it through, that's a real problem, because literally we cannot afford the time to control these technologies, make them more expensive, less scalable, when this is exactly what we need to give energy transition any realistic chance to be a success.
Right. Well, before we proceed further, I just want to, for the viewers, read out a small excerpt from your article. Mm-hmm. And it says that, this entire thing is extremely complicated and expensive as a result of the coordination of hundreds of highly specialized suppliers. No wonder the US government pressured the Dutch government to prevent ASML from delivering machinery to China. However, and this is the point that Ansgar Baums has been making, however, those who should know best, and he's referring to ASML executives themselves, acknowledge that technological leadership is much more ephemeral than policy wonks tend to think. The risk of designing out of technology is subject to export real. So Huawei's replacement of Qualcomm chips in its Mate 64, leading to a loss of 60 million chipset sales for Qualcomm in 2024, will most likely be much impacts to come. Now, let me come to Germany, one of America's very close and very, I would say, extremely important allies in Europe. Now, I remember Chancellor Scholz talk about Zeiten Wende, after the Russo-Ukraine war began. Mm-hmm. Now, I want to ask something. Germany traditionally has had very good trade relations with China, and across a broad range of things. Germany is also, as I said, very close to the United States. At what point do you think, I mean, in terms of balancing things, where Germany obviously has to watch out for its own interests also, without incurring cost as far as its relations with the United States are concerned, but at the same time, keeping things balanced out with China. So it's a difficult proposition. It's a pretty tightrope walking. How do you look at the situation?
Yeah, I think you described it very accurately. So first of all, let me point out there's an interesting dynamic happening in DC, which is also affecting Germany, which is there is no longer consensus between US tech companies and US government. Right, so they're fighting now over these export controls. So, and that's new.
I think you mentioned, yeah, I think you mentioned in that context, if I remember correctly, right?
Yeah. So you basically say, like, until now it was U.S. government and U.S. tech were basically on the same page when it came to dissemination of technology. That was a good thing. Now you basically have a divergence of interest. So U.S. government wants controls. Companies are reluctant because they want to sell in China in the future, because Tesla, Apple, etc., these companies making a lot of money in China, right? So, and that's right. Interesting because it resembles an historical pattern that you see when you have an hegemon challenged by a newcomer. So think of Great Britain and the German Empire in the late 19th century, when in the city of London there was the same dynamic happening. Companies that wanted to make business with Germany, while the British government was opposed to it because of geopolitical reasoning. This is happening now, and you can almost argue that these US companies are more aligned with Germany vis-a-vis the China question than with the US government, which means kind of, we like to, however you call it, muddling through, being a little bit more accommodating, like not being too harsh on it, slowing it down. That's basically an alignment between US corporates and the European position that we haven't seen in a long time. It's one of these ironies of geopolitics, isn't it? Overall, I'd say Germany has not really found an answer on how to respond to the pressure from the US side on one hand versus the requirements, economic necessities that we still have, because Germany is heavily invested in China. It goes back to a very, let's say, familiar discussion in Europe after the Second World War on how to position yourself in a new Cold War. There were ideas of Europe being a neutral space, a third space, a non-aligned, whatever kind of entity. It never happened, right? Because after 45, it was clear that the only realistic positioning of Europe would be at the side of the United States, and I think that was a correct reading of the geopolitical play at the time. Now, what is the correct reading of the play of today? My personal impression is, in the long run, the transatlantic partnership is without alternative to Europe, but it will be a two-level game for Europe. So it has to manage the geopolitical competition with China on the one side, but it also has to carefully manage the intra-relationship of the transatlantic alignment very carefully, because as the ASML case shows, interests are not 100% aligned. It is not in the interest of Europe that the US government is pressuring one of its member states, the Dutch government, enforcing export controls on the ASML, which are not perceived to be in European interest. And these tensions are very obvious now. For now, as you know, the European Union is a minor player in that game, simply because export controls are not in their mandate, right? That's a matter of national security. Hence, the EU has a very limited role. So for now, European countries are on their own when it comes to this discussion. What I perceive is that geopolitical pressure from both sides will lead to a reconsideration of the necessity to speak with one voice, to be a bigger player by also expanding EU prerogatives to matters of national security and export controls. And that's very contentious, because no one in Europe right now is ready to put the treaty question on the agenda, simply because we have so much populism, anti-European populism, that this is really a very complicated matter right now, and how to achieve more coherence in national security matters within the EU while not having to put up the treaty question, which is so contentious right now.
Right. The situation is in a state of flux, because within Europe, we are witnessing a lot of pressure because of internal domestic politics, right-wing populism. I mean, look at Germany, for instance. I mean, the AfD is still on the margins, but seems to be acquiring the kind of space which has forced the Germans to come out, take to the streets, and actually protest against the AfD agenda. But we're witnessing, in Hungary, in Italy, in Austria, in Serbia, a number of other, where even the consensus on the Russo-Ukraine war is kind of faltering. Also, in the event that there's a change of guard at the White House after the presidential elections, that's going to be another very important factor in determining, Sino-U.S. relations, and consequently the pressure that might come on the European countries, including top players like Germany in terms of economy, France also. UK is not part of the EU anymore, so I think, would you agree that in many ways, the hawkishness that you witness in the Beltway, what I referred to in my introduction, is something, given everything that's in a state of flux, they're going to make things more complex and more, the balance more tenuous?
Oh, absolutely. I think we have some really some stormy weather ahead of us, particularly from a European perspective. And it's not looking that rosy, right? I think the Ukraine war has accelerated this reckoning that the development from a unipolar world into a bipolar world comes with plenty of challenges, and probably Europe is one of the most vulnerable regions in the world to feel actually the impact, simply because the commitment of the US to the old deal that they had with Europe. Basically meaning US is paying for the defense, while Europe is happy to contribute to the global economy, but otherwise is keeping the military budgets really low. That comes to an end, and it comes at a point when you have to invest more money in defense, and you take away the Chinese market as a growth opportunity for European countries, and you look at the demographics, which are really bad in Europe in comparison to the US, by the way, you really come to the situation where Europe is in a very, very difficult spot for the next decades. And it's not looking that great, actually. What I find interesting here is that the fundamentals in the US are much more robust than in Europe, right? And still, the US perceives itself to be in this deep crisis. And this is where I think tech containment policies come from, when they come from this acknowledgement of weakness, which I find not really justified. It seems like the subjective perception of weakness in the US is somewhat decoupled from the realities. If you look at demographics, economic growth, the dominance of US companies, the innovation pipeline, it's all super strong. So that's one of these ironies again. Europe should be much more worried than the US when you look at the fundamentals.
But I think the US also is in a lot of trouble, if you will, in terms of the growing youth cohort and the discrepancy between how the young people look at the US foreign policies and also certain domestic policies, and how successive US governments have looked at those policies. I mean, a great example of that is this war in Gaza, and how the youth has approached the Palestinian question, and not just the Arab Americans, not just the African Americans, but also the younger Jewish Americans. So I think there is something needs to be said about how, in so many ways, the ground is shifting from under the feet of the fundamentals that you were talking about. I mean, and by fundamentals, I assume, or at least I mean, that the Democrats and the Republicans are, in a bipartisan manner, agreed on some of those fundamentals with reference to US security.
Well, I mean, it's a broad topic, right? But just like, if you look back in history, I think foreign policy making has been contentious in the US. Traditionally, it was not always a policy field of great consensus. If you look back, there have been vicious fights on how to position the US internationally. So, and if you look at what happened in the 70s, I mean, it was very, very toxic, and it was culture war, and foreign policy was a major part of the internal discussion in the US.
I absolutely. Without prejudice to what you're saying, I just want to add that there was no social media at that time.
Exactly,
I mean, you're not exchanging information in real time at the speed of light.
Yeah, true. But I just read two books, Nixon Land and Reagan Land by Mr. Pearlstein. Brilliant books. It's 1,600 pages. There's a lot, but you could literally copy pages from these books with regard to the toxicity of the discourse, the role of media, the culture war aspect of it, the invention of new ways to mobilize the population, back then via email list, whatever, or mailing list. But there's a lot which sounds very, very familiar. So I just want to caution a little bit of seeing that what's currently happening in the US as being not happening before. I think the US has been there before, and it was even more. I mean, cities were literally burning in the US in the 70s over policy issues like Vietnam. So I think we need to be a little bit, let's say, take a step back and view it from a historical perspective. And still, I think Farid Zakaria made a great point. He wrote this article in Foreign Affairs where he said, the US should not destroy the world order it created after 1990. And I think that's my main message here. Before abandoning this world order, take a good look at what the alternatives are. And again, my coming back to the export controls part of it is, we're throwing a couple of very innovative American companies under the bus right now. What for? What is the upside? How much of an advantage do you really gain by playing a zero-sum game here? And how actually do we align this tech cold war or tech containment, however we call it, on the one side, with the needs to somewhat cooperate globally on climate change and other pandemic issues, where we are really in dire straits and not much thought is actually given to. I was struck by the example I just read about the smallpox eradication during the Cold War, which was a huge success. If you compare that to how alignment or non-alignment on COVID vaccination actually ran, you could argue that we are in a worse spot than during the height of the Cold War in cooperating across the geopolitical fault line in matters of global relevance. And that, I think, should give us a reason to think about how do we actually get from this current situation where no collaboration at all is possible to a place where we can actually leverage technology and progress of technology to achieve a greener economy in the future. And that's what strikes me when I was in DC last year for a couple of months. Not much thought is spent on this question on how to collaborate in this new environment. And that's something I think we should spend more time on.
I think that's the paradox, and that's also the irony that we are now entering a period, especially climate-related, efforts, where no single state or a block of states, no matter how powerful, can singly or in tandem actually work this out. I mean, you really need a global cooperation for that, but it's coming at a time. I mean, this pressure is coming at a time when within this peer competition, you're actually going back really to the same kind of, the pressures on Athens and Sparta during the Peloponnesian Wars and, that famous Melian dialogue. And it's quite ironic that way. But I really think that, it was great to get your insights on this, Ansgar Baums. So thank you so much. There's so much more that one can discuss. And surely I will be waiting very eagerly for your book so that you can go back to relearning Persian that you had started learning, and you have enough time to do that. But thank you so much. This is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, click on the subscribe button. That helps us bring you quality discussions. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.